and welcome to DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. The recognition of the rights of people with disabilities in Europe took a great leap forward last December. Later on today's show, we'll show you excerpts from the first ever European Disabled People's Parliament. We'll also meet Lena Chartrand, a writer and playwright who's currently studying screenwriting at the Canadian Film Centre. And for all of you sports fans, we also have a story about 3 baseball players who have disabilities. And we have a baseball quiz coming up at the end of the show. First, here's this week's Disability News highlights. Thousands of Canadians who survived the polio epidemic of the 1950s are now discovering polio-like symptoms as they get older. Doctors call it post-polio syndrome. CBC reporter Brenda Craig has more on the story.
Not too fast for me.
More than 30 years ago, Tim Pasakaka survived polio.
I came out with a corset, leg irons and walking sticks, and took intensive physiotherapy until I was 9 or 10 years old.
He thought that was all behind him. Bright, energetic, a successful businessman, he was raising a young family. But then his muscles began to feel weak, and so did he.
To the point where I literally would go in the afternoons and sleep in my office on the floor.
He discovered he had post-polio syndrome, a fatigue so debilitating he can no longer work and requires frequent rest periods. Until the 1950s, polio caused paralyzing nerve damage. In Canada, there are some 25,000 polio survivors. Doctors don't know why exactly, but up to half of them may develop post-polio syndrome. One theory is that the survivors have overworked the muscles and nerves not damaged by the polio virus.
We do know that they overuse that muscle in order to compensate, in order to keep up. So instead of running on 8 cylinders like a car, they run on 6 cylinders.
The only treatment for post-polio syndrome, as Nazira Remutala discovered, is more physiotherapy. The syndrome forced her to quit her secretarial job.
I don't stress myself out as much as I used to. I take rest in between, and that helps me a lot.
So were you practicing for your school concert?
Doctors have no cure for post-polio syndrome. The long-term effect of the disease is not known, but it's hoped it won't compare with what many Canadians have already lived through.
Canada and the United States have approved the use of a genetically engineered drug which offers the first new treatment in 30 years for people with cystic fibrosis. The new drug to be sold under the trade name Pulmozyme isn't a cure, but clinical tests have shown it can reduce severe respiratory tract infections for people with cystic fibrosis by 27%. And for the first time, it can increase lung function. Close to 3,000 people in Canada are affected by cystic fibrosis, a hereditary disease that causes chronic respiratory infection. More than 1,000 people in Canada have contracted HIV through blood transfusions. Now they're seeking compensation. That compensation won't be finalized until an inquiry into Canada's tainted blood supply is concluded. In the meantime, some people, frustrated by the wait, are being forced to make compromises. Jeannie Lee has more details.
The tree is beautiful.
Bobby and his mother Lena spend each Christmas as if it were their last together, because it might be.
Not too bad. Not too bad at all.
Bobby is HIV positive, infected by a tainted blood transfusion during a heart operation 13 years ago.
To know that my son's not going to be here eventually because somebody messed up, I mean, they could have been more careful, they could have been more screening.
Exactly who messed up won't be known until a Royal Commission inquiry next fall. But long before then, Lena, Bobby, and about 800 other Canadian families have to decide on an offer by the provincial governments, contained in documents delivered the week before Christmas.
They have to receive it by March the 15th, 1994, or we end up getting nothing. And it's hard. It's very, very hard.
Accepting means giving up the right to make any more claims. But Bobby would get a check right away for $22,000, plus $30,000 each year he stays alive. To a 16-year-old, it sounds like a lot.
Even if I didn't have all kinds of money, I'd still have a great life.
His eyes, he has to lay down for that.
But Lena knows how much it costs to care for a son with HIV. She had to leave her job and go on mother's assistance. She says Bobby's federal money is nearly gone, and they can't wait out a long legal battle.
If Bobby were to have already passed on, there's no way I'd be taking this package. I would be fighting them tooth and nail. But because Bobby is still alive, because the medications are keeping him healthy, that is what we need.
And immediate need seems to be a strong motivator. The Canadian Blood Agency, which is administering the assistance package, says that 12 Canadian families have already formally accepted, less than a week after receiving their offers in writing. The agency says the March 15th deadline is to get assistance checks out as soon as possible, but a hemophiliacs rights group doesn't buy that explanation.
That deadline is cynical on the part of the governments because it is an effort to alleviate as much of their liability as they possibly can before possibly very damaging information comes out in the inquiry.
And although Lena would like to wait, she knows some things can't, like the things that make Bobby happy.
Super Nintendo video games.
And the treatments that keep him healthy. Jeannie Lee, CBC News, Niagara Falls.
The transit system in Winnipeg is testing a new method which attempts to give more freedom to passengers with sight impairments. 20 people will be given plastic cards that signal the route number they want to passing bus drivers. The simple but potentially effective system was developed by a bus driver in British Columbia. Winnipeg will test it as a pilot project for 6 months. That's this week's roundup of disability news highlights. When we come back, Europe affirms its commitment to the rights of people with disabilities. In many parts of the world, disability concerns are moving away from charity and towards human rights. Last December, that move got a boost when the European Community's branch of Disabled Peoples International and the European Commission and Parliament launched the first ever European Disabled Peoples Parliament. We'll show you excerpts from that day in a moment. Here in Canada, the rights of people with disabilities are recognized in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But what is the significance of those rights? Henry Enns, Executive Director of Disabled Peoples International, feels it profoundly influences our approach to disability issues.
For years, I was quite prepared to accept not being able to get into buildings, thinking that if I couldn't get a job for myself, well, that was my own problem. It wasn't a problem of human rights. And many disabled people go through that. They say, well, yes, we can't get this, we can't get independent living, we can't get attendant care services, but it's not really an issue of human rights for us. And it's not until disabled people come together at many different levels and learn from each other from one country to another that we realize, yes, it is an issue of discrimination. It is an issue, whether, even though it's an issue of paternalism very often, that people don't do it out of ill will, it is still an issue that our social, our cultural, our economics rights of disabled people are being denied in so many different forms. And that is a human rights issue.
This issue about rights is down to us. It is down to us. We are the oppressed people of this world.
Human rights was the focus last December the 3rd on the United Nations International Day of Disabled Persons, when the European Parliament in Brussels played host to over 400 people with disabilities. They came together from all over Europe to put forward a resolution that would address their concerns.
And we hope that other people will be able to...
Amongst the organizers of the session were Rachel Hurst, the chairperson of Disabled Peoples International for the European Community.
They not only understood the importance of a day for disabled people's human rights, but they gave us every support to make something happen.
Time and time again.
And Derek Prague, member of the European Parliament and the chairperson for the Intergroup on Disability.
Until recently, believe it or not, I had never heard anyone speak about the human rights of disabled people in terms of human rights. After all, the human rights of disabled people should be exactly the same as those of any able-bodied person. We only think about human rights when they are not respected. And that is precisely why Disabled Peoples International is right. The human rights of disabled people are not respected. I know, and I'm sure that all who are here today also know, that attitudes, thank God, have greatly changed since the 18th century, when, to the shame of the human race, going to torment the so-called lunatics at Bedlam, fellow human beings, we would say today, with severe learning difficulties, constituted a day out, an excursion for the able-bodied.
I need to get across one very simple message. And this is a message that we have to get across today. And we will have to go on getting across day after day, year in, year out, until everybody understands it, which is that disability is a human rights issue.
Demokratie, Frieden, gegenseitige Achtung und Menschenrechte.
Egon Klepsch, the president of the European Parliament, was a strong supporter of that message.
Missverständnissen oder
The
Vorurteilen.
disabled are victims of prejudices and discriminations. Your presence here today is an expression of the fact that you are decided to act, to react, so that you understood by the other ones, and you want to be people that have equal opportunities.
I can't tell you how very glad I am.
Ken Coates is the chairperson of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Human Rights. He pointed out that the colossal scope of the Parliament's new building in Brussels represented an overcoming of a democratic deficit. Nobody, he stated, would have built a parliament on such a scale if they hadn't intended that it exercise authority or hold officials who administer for the public accountable.
The Disabled People's Parliament, like the Pensioners' Parliament which met before it last week, is an affirmation that the other democratic deficit cannot be allowed to continue. The other democratic deficit is the maintenance of a wall of exclusion, which leaves outside the discussion all kinds of social forces, all kinds of people who do not have access in the normal way to a public space.
For the 34 million disabled Europeans who are...
The Parliament's commissioner responsible for social affairs, Padraig Flynn, echoed the European community's commitment to people with disabilities.
As the Commissioner for Social Affairs, I believe that a fundamental commitment to equal opportunities, opportunities to choose a lifestyle most suited to one's own needs, preferences, abilities, and goals, is essential to the achievement of full human rights for disabled people, indeed all members of society. Equally important is an explicit rejection of values, attitudes, and actions which discriminate against individuals and their families, and an unequivocal resolve to counter social exclusion.
The motion for resolution, recognizing that disability...
Rachel Hurst put forward the resolution outlining an affirmation of commitment to human rights for people with disabilities.
Bearing in mind that every person is born equal and has the same rights to life and welfare, education, living independently, equal opportunities for employment and active participation in all aspects of society, recognizing that disabled people have the right to full and equal participation in the economic and social development of Europe, considering that any direct discrimination or any other negative discriminatory treatment of a disabled person is a violation of his or her rights, convinced that disabled people should be guaranteed equal opportunity through the elimination of all socially determined barriers, be they physical, financial, social, or psychological, which exclude or restrict full participation in society, realizing that disabled people face three forms of unfair discrimination: direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and unequal burdens imposed by socially constructed barriers.
The Commission will give its utmost consideration to the resolution voted upon today, and we will do all we can within the Commission's competence to counter discrimination and social exclusion and to promote equal opportunities for disabled people throughout Europe.
People in Brussels and other towns and cities in Europe also recognize the International Day of Disabled Persons by holding 24-hour human rights vigils. Years ago, the people of Timmins, Ontario spoke of Lena Chartrand as their own Little Miss Easter Seals. Now they can speak of her as one of a handful of Canadians chosen to study at the Canadian Film Centre. Lena Chartrand is a writer. She has spent years writing poetry and plays drawn from her life experience. Recently, her play, Little Miss Easter Seals, based on her own childhood, ran in Toronto. During an interview at the Film Centre, she spoke candidly about her life and her work.
I don't have any secrets when I'm writing, and I want to write about my own life, which isn't like everybody else's life. You know, I write about being gay, and I write about being a woman with a disability. Actually, I don't write about those things necessarily. I accept them as givens. I accept them as how my world is defined.
As Queen of the Winter Carnival, I'm making this year's celebrations living proof that Timmins is the town with a heart of gold.
Timmins in northern Ontario, it's a mining town. My dad moved there in the 40s after the war to work in the mines, and we grew up there.
Is Ontario's Little Miss Easter Seals. Your whole class came to the station! Bye!
I naturally often create characters who have a disability, because that's part of my reality, and it's not always the issue or, you know, the core of the story.
What do you care if I'm miserable? You forgot it! Macron's dumb.
Since when did you talk to me like that?
I guess I've always had a vivid imagination, and I think as a child with a disability, I had to amuse myself. And, you know, it's amazing when you read, you know, the life stories of people like Bergman or, you know, other filmmakers, you know, the greats of the 20th century, how many of them had a disability as a child or were sick for a long period of time and had to amuse themselves. So you learn to, you know, to visualize your stories in your head. My first feature film script was the story of a love affair between a nun and a married woman. And it was one of those stories that, you know, is kind of based on a real story that I know. And that I know there are tons of stories like that, tons of them. And I don't know why Canadians aren't telling those stories. You know, why we're just telling the sort of accepted, you know, growing up on the prairies. Or I actually think that in all of the arts, that it would be healthier in our society if more people could be involved at whatever level they wanted to be. You know, if there were little art centers on every block, and people painted and people made music, people wrote poetry, just as much as people play baseball. Many people hesitate to go into the arts because they're afraid of the financial insecurity. If you really are passionate to do it, you can usually get some financial assistance or whatever to get it done. So it's a matter of being patient and believing in yourself. And if you believe in yourself, other people will believe in you.
Lena Chartrand is currently completing her 9-month residency in screenwriting. She hopes her current work will be ready for public viewing in the near future. Now, put your brains into trivia mode. We'll hit you with our baseball question when we come back.
Now the 2-2. Well hit down the left field line. Way back and go! The winners and still world champions, the Toronto Blue Jays.
Looking back at the year in sports, perhaps the most significant story was the performance of the Toronto Blue Jays in winning the World Series for the 2nd time in a row. Is a three-peat in the works? Maybe. But first they'll have to overcome as many obstacles as they did in 1993. Two of the opposing players who gave the Blue Jays a rough time last year were athletes with disabilities.
But it's all baseball now as Jim Abbott prepares to take on the Blue Jays, and here's a guy that's been throwing very well lately. What he's done, he's won 3 straight.
Who could forget the efforts of Jim Abbott, the Yankees' outstanding pitcher? Certainly not the Jays, who as division rivals saw more than enough of his exceptional pitching.
Double play!
I don't think about my hand. It's not an everyday constant thing. You know, I don't wake up and say, oh, I have one hand. And I never knew how it was to have 2 hands. And this is the way I grew up. I learned to do everything like this, and I don't feel like I've been shortchanged.
How about that? A 1-6-3 double play, 2 away.
In Game 2 of the World Series, it was Phillies outfielder Jim Eisenreich's turn to shine.
The 0-2 to Eisenreich. Fly ball to right, well hit. Carter sprinting back. It's over his head. A 3-run homer for Jim Eisenreich.
Eisenreich, who has Tourette's syndrome, made the difference with his 3-run homer in Philadelphia's 6-4 win over the Jays.
Eisenreich with 7 home runs during the season, and he gets all of this one. Look at the crowd standing up.
And 1994 may well see the Major League debut of Curtis Pride. Pride, who is deaf, plays for the Ottawa Lynx, a AAA farm team of the Montreal Expos.
But the fact is the kid's a heck of a ball player, and you don't want to let the fact that he doesn't hear override that. I mean, this kid can really play.
Disabled people can do whatever they want to do as long as they don't let their disability get in the way.
Jim Abbott, Jim Eisenreich, and Curtis Pride, 3 athletes, any or all of whom could upset the Jays' attempt at a three-peat. And still on baseball, we've all seen the colorful gesturing of umpires at baseball games. But do you know why these signals were added to the game? And what was the name of the player who caused umpires to make this addition? If you think you know the answers, drop us a line. If you have the correct answers and we draw your name, we'll send you a DNet t-shirt and cap, as well as a CBC coffee mug. That's our show. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. DNet will be preempted next weekend and the weekend after. We'll see you again in 3 weeks on January 29th on most stations. Check your local listings. Now, here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. This program is brought to you in part by the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto and the Canadian Association of Independent Living Centres.